Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice and I, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Welcome to episode 123 of the Feeling Good podcast. We had some really good feedback from our episode on the 10 errors that most therapists make. So we're going to do 10 more today. How's that sound, David?
That sounds great. And you were going to mention that we also had great feedback from our show last week.
Oh, yeah. The show on how to say no. We had the highest number of download on a single day for any episode.
That's fantastic. Jill is wonderful. It was a wonderful topic, but who came up with that topic?
I don't know. Can you remember?
I can remember very well. You've been pushing for a long time to have a show on the importance of saying no, and I couldn't figure out how to do it. So I kept procrastinating because you've got to have some good material, some good story or a vignette or some points to make. And then when Jill dawned on me that that's something Jill Levitt has been working on, and when she agreed to be on our show, it just made for a terrific winner, and I'm really happy that people enjoyed it. And
one of my clients listened to that show and had assigned it as homework, and she said she really enjoyed the role play with Jill. Jill is really good, of course. Who wouldn't enjoy role play with her? But that really went over well. So
yeah, terrific.
You have a few announcements, I think.
Huh?
You have a few announcements?
Well, yeah, we'll make them real quick. Also, I've been struggling with laryngitis, so if I hack and cough and sound repulsive on the show, that's why I'll try not to.
You mean
too
more
much.
Repulsive than usual?
Yeah, right, exactly. But there are several upcoming workshops. One that you're going to love is on February 10th. It's a full-day workshop I'm doing with Jill Levitt as my co-presenter, sponsored by the Feeling Good Institute, and it's on ending habits and addictions, both your own and those of your patients. And you can, it's a one-day workshop. It comes with CE credits. It's sold out in person, and we're getting tremendous interest in the show for some reason. But there still are some spaces available for the online, but they're limited also. So move fast if you're interested. It costs $135, and I think it's just going to be a fun and tremendous day. You can find the link on my website on the workshop tab, www.feelinggood.com.
Yeah.
And then go to the workshops, and you'll find a registration link for this and all of my upcoming workshops. And then a second one I'm going to do with Jill with the same exact format, in person and online. And this one, there's still room for the in person, but it'll probably sell out fast. It's on May 19th, 2019, and it'll be Team CBT for anxiety disorders, step-by-step training for therapists. I think that's going to be a tremendous one also. And then I'm going to do 2 summer intensives this summer. One of them, you can get the link, is July 15th through 18 in Calgary, Canada. And those are always fun. And then July 29th to August 1st, 2019, the annual South San Francisco intensive. And I don't have the link for registration and for the brochure yet, but I should have it by Monday on the website.
Do you know who's putting it up? Is it IAHP or?
Well, IAHP is kind of merging with another company now.
Okay.
And I think it's called Praxis, Praxis.
All right.
And I'm going to also be creating some online classes for therapists, maybe also for the general public, with their sponsorship this year. And there's 3 tremendous programs I'm working on, but I'll announce them later on, and I'm kind of excited. I'm going to try to transition more into online training. I'm getting a little tired of airports, but I've paid my dues. I think 30 or maybe even 50,000 therapists have attended my in-person workshops in the last 20, 30 years. And, but I've had so many canceled flights. I just love teaching. I love the audiences, but I'm going to see if I can make it work as well for online, where you can interact live during the actual, and it'll be like 2 hours a week for 10 weeks on various different themes.
That sounds great. I mean, a lot of people, especially people who can't travel to big cities to take the intensives, can certainly benefit from this.
Yeah, and I've got 3 topics I'm just totally psyched about. So I'll put them on the website also.
All right.
When we've got them scheduled.
So shall we start with today's topic?
Yeah.
So we have those 10 errors in no particular order, but we'll see how it comes about. Okay.
Yeah.
So one error that you noted was that therapists fail to hold their patients accountable. And I mean, I've seen that in my own practice myself, even to this day after practicing team for a long time now, I still am not perfect at it. And so, and you talk about the homework. What other ways do we fail to hold our patients accountable? And why should we to begin with? After all, it's their trip, and it's their money.
Yeah, well, this is all, of course, according to the doctrine of team therapy, and it's not, the last word. It's just one approach. But we make patients accountable in the treatment of depression, and it's what's the work that the patient's going to have to do to recover. And I've published quite a bit of research in top psychology journals, longitudinal causal modeling kind of things, showing that psychotherapy homework has a massive effect on outcome, on recovery from depression. And so when I'm treating someone with depression, I require them, and I negotiate this at the very initial evaluation, require them to do homework. But it's kind of hard because you have to do something called sitting with open hands to say to the patient, if you want me to treat your depression, and believe me, I've got fabulous tools, and I believe I can show you how to recover, and probably quickly, but you'll have to agree to do psychotherapy homework. And of course, no patient wants to do psychotherapy homework, and so it has to be issued as a gentle ultimatum, namely that if you want me to work with you, this will not be negotiable. And if you want the kind of treatment that most therapists do, where you just come and talk, but there's no homework assignments, I'm not the therapist that you're looking for. And it took me quite a few years to come to the conviction and the decision to do that. And boy, it just has transformed my practice. But with patients with anxiety, there's a separate issue. You're going to have to use exposure. And no anxious patient wants to do exposure. So it's the same gentle ultimatum. And there's also gentle ultimatum if they have relationship problems. You're going to have to work on yourself, to change yourself rather than blaming your spouse. And for habits and addictions, you're going to have to give up the greatest source of pleasure in your life and trade it in for discipline and deprivation. But the trick of it, in each of those 4 instances, the therapist takes the position of the gentle ultimatum plus dangling the carrot. Like, I can sure show you how to turn around your conflict with your husband or your wife or your son or your daughter, but you're going to have to pinpoint your own role in the problem, like we did in the life therapy with Lee. And it's very, very painful. And it's my thinking that if you are unwilling to hold your patients accountable and you give in to their, well, just treat my anxiety, but I don't want that exposure, or whatever, you're going to have a much lower success rate.
Well, let me ask you a little bit of a probing question on this, because in my experience, almost never do my clients on the initial consultation say, oh, no, I don't want to do the homework. It's extremely rare. And so they'll say, yes, sure, no problem. In fact, they gladly commit to half an hour a day for 5 days a week, no problem. But then it's over time, in the beginning, you do a little bit of empathy and
they start slipping.
And you go, okay, well, that's all right. They did most of the homework, or they did some of the homework, and then one day they show up, they didn't do any of the homework. Oh, they were busy that week, and gee, you know, I have this big project at work. My daughter was sick. Okay, but they are not getting any better.
Yeah. Well, what has helped me with that is, I'm not sure if you use this, but in my therapist toolkit, I've something called the concept of self-help memo.
Yeah, that's what I give them when they first come in.
And they fill that out. Well, then that kind of empowers you, because when that happens, then I say to the patient, you know, it seems like you're kind of been slacking off a little bit on the homework. And by the way, if they're doing some homework, that's good enough. Yeah. You know, and I have real low standards once they're, because if they're just doing something, the prognosis is good. But if they stop doing it entirely, then I would say, I'm afraid I might have led you on and gotten you into a kind of therapy that really isn't something that you want. And you're aware that to continue with me, the homework will be mandatory. But why don't we go back and look at that memo you filled out? And when I listed 25 good reasons not to do psychotherapy homework, and let's see the ones you ticked off, and see if you can find a solution to that problem. Or maybe you're saying to me that you've decided that this is not the therapy for you. I hope you'll stick with me. I like you. I want to work with you. But you have to know that doing the homework is going to be not negotiable.
Yeah.
And that seems to work.
Yeah.
Work very well. Getting that contract initially and having them lay their cards on the table and give all the reasons not to do homework. For an anxious patient, all the reasons not to have to use exposure. It's a kind of a form of empathy and seeing the world through the patient's eyes. But at some point, you have to make the patient accountable. And that's what a lot of therapists are afraid to do. And what I was afraid to do for years, I thought if I'm just nice enough, they'll eventually come around, and over time I came to the discovery and the conclusion that just wasn't valid.
Yeah. Okay. So here's the second error that you've noted, that you called that the corrective emotional experience in quotes, and well, can you say what that is?
This is an old concept. And by the way, on all of these, I'm just giving my point of view. I never want to express my point of view as being some kind of ultimate truth. You know, I can be very opinionated, and sometimes I have strong opinions that are incorrect. But this corrective emotional experience is something that, that was taught to me when I was a psychiatric resident. And I think a lot of therapists are familiar with it. And you think that just a long-term kind of talking relationship with a patient over months or even years that will correct their emotional problems. And you're most likely to fall into this kind of pattern, say, with patients with borderline personality disorder, and maybe fancy that you're the loving parent they never had, and that just being with you every week is going to somehow heal them and cause them to recover. And while I believe, as you know, that empathy and compassion are vitally important ingredients of therapy, they're not sufficient to cure anyone of anything. And this corrective emotional experience, I think personally, there might be some validity to it, but it's kind of baloney, because people need to use specific tools and skills to change their life. And just hanging out with a therapist is not going to have anything more than a placebo effect. And in addition, we were talking in the car today at lunch, and you were pointing out some of David's shortcomings. Remember?
I did. Moi?
and you criticized me very severely and correctly that sometimes I'm very opinionated and it's hard for people to contradict me. They're afraid of me and stuff like that. I just said guilty as accused. And those are just some of my many flaws. And the idea that hanging out with David would be a corrective emotional experience is kind of like the edge of psychosis. But I do have some fabulous tools. And if you want to work with me, I can help you change your life in a way that'll be pretty amazing. But I don't fancy that somehow just being with me is going to, correct somebody's underlying insecurities or fears. But a good relationship is important. That's why we measure it every session. And I try to get perfect scores at least 80% of the time on the empathy scale. And with you too, I mean, if we don't have a good relationship, we won't want to work together. Yeah. But we need more than just a good relationship to have a good podcast or to have good therapy. You've got to be using tools and skills. But this corrective emotional experience is seductive to therapists. A lot of these errors come from therapists' narcissism. And I think it's flattering to therapists to think that they have this patient, especially, forgive me for saying it, but if it's a full fee private patient and who wants to come and just talk with you endlessly, and they like it, and you like it, and you get paid for it. But to me, it's not real therapy.
Mm-hmm. Let me push on that a little bit. Imagine somebody who actually never had any nurturing relationship. Not their parents, not their family, not their kids, not their spouse, not their friends. And finally, they land in a therapist's office, and this is the very first person in their lives
who's warm and caring.
Who's warm and caring, yeah.
And that's tremendously important. You can't underestimate that. And we've even seen that. You're a cat person and we're cat people. And, like my OB who we adopted, who was so untrusting and near death, a predatory feral cat. And he never had a human to relate to. And he was paranoid and violent. And by loving him, he opened up and just blossomed. And I'm sure it's the same with humans too. So that's why you want to measure empathy every session and make sure you're coming across in a warm and caring way. But the empathy alone will not be sufficient to help the patient develop good relations with others, to overcome any anxiety disorder, to recover from depression, to give up an addiction. It's a necessary part of therapy, but it's not going to be sufficient for a cure or for real changes in the patient's life.
Right.
Was that okay? How about you?
Yeah, no, I think that's a satisfactory answer. I think that it's true that you want to create a nurturing environment.
Yeah.
That's kind of like the soil for growing the healthy plants,
Yeah, and in our relationship too, if we have a good nurturing relationship, then we can get mad at each other, we can criticize each other and talk it through. It'll make our relationship deeper and better. And so those things are incredibly important in all of life.
Yeah. Okay. Number 3, responding defensively to patient criticism. Now, I can see there that, of course, this has to do with the 5 secrets of effective communication. But I don't think that a lot of therapists respond defensively. They still maintain a modicum of professionalism. But I suspect that you have some specific ideas about what you mean here.
Well, the disarming technique, which is one of the 5 secrets, means finding the truth in a patient's criticism or the criticism of a colleague, like you had criticisms of me today at lunch, or a loved one and the family. And by agreeing with the criticism, you can put the lie to it. But what I've observed is that pretty much 100% of the time, when therapists get a criticism from a patient, they do respond defensively. They explain themselves. They justify themselves. And I think therapists aren't even aware when they're doing this. But it becomes very important in team because we use the empathy form the patients fill out in the waiting room, and it's very sensitive to therapeutic failures, and patients will write down things that turn them off about the session. And most therapists have a real tough time not responding defensively. If the patient says, "Oh, you don't really care about me," the therapist will say, but I do care about you, and something like that, which is just contradicting the patient. There was an article. It's a real famous article. You may be familiar with it from your PhD training. But it was a study by the National Institute of Mental Health in Atlanta, Georgia, of psychoanalysts, and they recorded all of their sessions for 5 years, and they were doing some kind of study or other about psychoanalysis. But then they did a secondary analysis, and I don't know if Hans Strupp was involved in this.
Okay.
But he's a famous
Yeah.
guy. But they decided to go back and see how what happened when the patients criticized the psychoanalysts. Mm-hmm. And then they reported, and I can almost quote it verbatim, it says, we were surprised to discover that the main deterrent to the development of a deep relationship was not the patient's maladaptive defenses, but the psychoanalysts. Mm-hmm. And they said over the 5 years, there was not a single time when patients criticized the analyst that the analyst did not respond defensively. And then they said, we don't know if this has to do with psychoanalysis or something about the people in Atlanta, Georgia, or whatever. But I think that has nothing to do with psychoanalysis. It's just all therapists do this, but without really noticing. I can also give you a little somewhat humorous vignette on this.
Oh, sure.
I was doing when I lived in Philadelphia, I went to Lancaster every year to teach at a hospital had a religiously based hospital there. And it was really a beautiful place, and the staff were just awesome. And I went every Saturday for a half a day for about 10 weeks. And I was teaching them about the 5 secrets of effective communication, how to respond to patient criticism with disarming and empathy and stroking and I feel statements and stuff. And they were all pairing off. And then I was going to do a demonstration. And then the chairman of the hospital, or president or the chairman of the Department of Psychiatry or something, wandered in just to see how he hadn't been in the training. Mm-hmm. And I said, so I need a volunteer to be a patient and someone to be a therapist. And he said, oh, I'll volunteer to be the therapist. Ah. I said, oh, no, this isn't a good idea. He doesn't know what he's getting in for. And so someone volunteered to be the patient. And then I said, now remember, the main thing is acknowledge the patient's anger, find truth in what the patient is saying, kind of reviewed the basic principles. And so we started the role play, and the patient's going to give one attack, and then the therapist is going to give one response, and then we're going to grade that response. And so this woman played the role of a very angry, oppositional patient with a personality disorder, and I guess she knew him too, so she actually started ripping into him. Yeah. And he started turning bright red, when he was listening. You could just see him tightening up. And then she stopped, and now he's supposed to give this warm, disarming response. And he was quiet for about 15 seconds, and then he leaned forward and he said, "You must have had a very troubled childhood." It was like something I guess he learned in residency. But the problem is that when patients criticize you, they're telling you something that's always true, even if they're saying it in an exaggerated or hostile way. Yeah. And if you defend yourself, you just prove that your criticisms are right, because her criticism in the role play is, you don't seem to care about me, you don't seem to understand me. And then he responds by, attacking her, which is exactly what her complaint was. Yeah. Even though it was a role play, it was existing on many levels.
Yeah, well, I had it's funny what you were talking about in the number one. I had a client who, after I sat with open hands and issued the gentle ultimatum, said, well, this is coercive tactics.
Yes,
and
exactly.
I said, it's true. It's really putting you in a box, and I can certainly imagine that this is frustrating for you. And this is the only way that I can work with you. Otherwise, I have no way to help you. So I'd love to hear what you suggest. And but that,
how'd she respond? How did that go? I give you high points on that.
Well, he kind of went quiet. He said, I think I like my depression.
Yeah.
I said, well, if you do, far from me from to want to take it away from you. I think that if that works for you, and we can make a list of reasons why you wouldn't want to keep it.
Yeah.
But if there's only one way that I can help you, and it has to be through your own willingness.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a status quo.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't have to be willing.
Yeah. Well, good example.
So here's our number 4. You said joining a school of therapy. Now, I mean, when I first studied psychology, I don't know if I joined a school of therapy per se, but I was trained in a particular framework.
What was it?
Transpersonal.
Oh.
So it's a combination of existential, humanistic, and spiritual.
Oh.
And that's something that really worked for me. This is, it resonated with my personality.
Yeah.
And here I am now using CBT for most of my methods. So,
but I'm sure incorporating some dimensions.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I use mindfulness, and I use somatic techniques. So I don't feel like I restricted myself to one school of therapy, but you seem to think that many therapists do.
I don't have any data on it, but I do know that of the people who come to my workshops, they tend to identify themselves as a this or a that. I'm an EMDR therapist, or I'm doing DBT, or I'm psychodynamic type of thing. And this is something I have strong feelings about. I might be wrong, but for better or worse, my point of view. And this is my most unpopular criticism of therapist errors. This is the thing when I say people hate me the most. A lot of people get very angry, so I apologize ahead of time for saying it. First, let me say what's good about the schools of therapy. You can learn some really good techniques, and hopefully from someone with wisdom and experience that you don't have, who's found some things that can be helpful to some people. So when I became, in the early days, a cognitive therapist, it was so much more effective than the non-specific stuff I was trained in as a psychiatric resident. I became very, very excited. But
so
now
you became a cognitive therapist?
Yeah, probably for a period of time. I would have seen myself that way. Now I see myself as a human therapist who uses methods from many different schools of therapy. But team is not a new school of therapy. At least that's not the way we think about it. We think about it as a structure for how all of psychotherapy works. It's based on research and is data-driven. The testing, empathy, agenda setting, and then methods is a structure for doing psychotherapy. And it's my feeling that we should get rid of all the schools of psychotherapy. It can help you learn some stuff, but the problem is they function much like cults, and you've got to believe in the guru. You're supposed to do this specific type of therapy. We know the cause of psychiatric problems, psychological problems. We have the most effective approaches. Now, all therapists don't fall into that, but an awful lot do. And it's much like joining a religion or a cult. It gives you a sense of identity and a sense of belonging and a sense of being special. But it's anti-scientific. It's cult-driven to my way of thinking. And the best analogy I have for expressing my own point of view is that, I was trained as a physician, and we don't have schools of medicine. Like, you don't have a penicillin school, for example. Can you imagine if you went to the doctor with a broken arm and he said, well, I'm going to prescribe penicillin, and you say, well, I have a broken arm. Why are you giving me penicillin? He says, well, I do penicillin therapy. I'm in the penicillin school. It would be nonsensical. And yet that's how psychotherapy is organized. You know, if you have depression, you go to a cognitive therapist, you'll get cognitive therapy. You go to a psychodynamic therapist, you'll get psychodynamic therapy. You go to an EMDR therapist, you'll get EMDR. You go to an ACT therapist, you'll get ACT. And there's hundreds of schools of therapy, and it just strikes me as nonsensical that the treatment you would receive for what you want help with, whether it's a troubled marriage or depression or panic attacks, that would depend on the personal preference of the therapist that you go to. So that's kind of my spiel, and I'm hoping that the psychotherapy will move to a more powerful and scientific format.
Well, I think there's a lot of presupposition that are included in that. You compare that to medicine, which, you know, a lot of times we do. In fact, many therapists even compare what they do to what medical doctors do. I think it's different, though. I think it's not like we're curing a disease. In fact, the things that are identified as actual diseases and that make it into the DSM, you go see an MD for those. You go see a psychiatrist or a neurologist. But everything else, and that, in my opinion, is the majority. I think, in fact, we're going to talk about this, about, you know, talking about disorders. It's not, I think the medical model is not necessarily the most appropriate for psychotherapy.
Well, that's a good point, because even in team therapy, we're involved in not viewing these as mental disorders, but as manifestations of your strengths.
Yeah.
And with positive reframing, moving people toward a more positive way of seeing themselves and their symptoms. And it's really helping people become not only happier and free of anxiety, but in a sense more fulfilled human beings. So you may be onto something there, that the model, what we're trying to do, is inherently quite different from medicine for the most part, and so maybe we can stick with the schools of therapy. That's certainly another way of looking at it, and there's tremendous merit to that as well.
Well, I'd like to refer our listeners to the book by Bruce Wampold called The Great Psychotherapy Debate, where he makes the case that the methods you're using have simply to be well researched and appropriate to what it is you're treating, but also the empathy part, what he calls the relationship, and the motivation, which is what he calls the client factors, are also part of the package.
Well, that's what we were talking about just a few minutes ago, that the relationship is very important. Can I give you a little bit of fresh research on that?
Oh, yeah.
And this might...
I love fresh research.
Okay. Well, this is something informal, but I got some emails. People are saying, what's the proof that you get such dramatic changes in single therapy sessions? And so I just, for the heck of it, pulled out about 60 files that I have of the last 60 people that I've worked with, the before and end of session, to say how much change am I seeing within a single session, and what are the factors that might be contributing to that? Because, you know, I'm measuring empathy and changes in belief in negative automatic thoughts and things of that type. And this is very not very valid research. It's not publishable. It was just an informal thing. I worked up the first 20 patients, and I'm going to work up the next 30, add to the database if anyone thinks it has merit. I'm not sure that it's even worth doing this study. But I was just kind of curious, and it came out that the reduction in depression, anxiety, and anger in the first session, the single session, was between 90 and 93% reduction in those. And it was highly associated with changes in negative thoughts, belief in negative thoughts. And the empathy thing looked like it was having a zero causal effect. It's kind of like what we were talking about earlier, that the relationship is important, because I couldn't have gotten that change in belief and negative thoughts without the trust and the warmth. But the actual change seems to come from the methods, from like positive reframing and all of the externalization of voices and acceptance paradox, and identify the distortions and things of that nature. There's a kind of there's some fellow out there, one of the kind of measurement gurus, who actually likes my work because of the measurement tools I've developed. I'm trying to think of his name.
Scott Miller?
Yeah, Scott Miller, right. And he's moving in the right direction. But he's saying that he's great. I like him too. But he's saying it's all in the therapeutic relationship. But the problem is the kind of therapy he's doing, there isn't much effect above and beyond the placebo effect. So there's really, if you don't have great techniques, then your research won't show an impact of great techniques. And so my findings are, in a way you might say, completely on the opposite side of the spectrum as his results. Again, not trying to say I'm right and he's wrong, but that my data is dramatically inconsistent with that.
Well, you know why the research, the personal research I just mentioned, is not publishable. You know why that is, right?
Well, I can think of about 4 or 5 reasons.
So what's the number one reason?
Well, first you'd have to get published, like the things I published in psychology journals. You've got to have a diagnostic evaluation, describe your patient set. For a good outcome study, you'd want to have random assignment to multiple therapists. Maybe it's just because David's old and famous, and so people respond like magic. There's just so many unexplained.
Yeah, so you could say it's a David thing. You could say David is the only one who can have those results. But even if you could prove that would be an interesting result. I have another idea, which is that the group that you work with is self-selected.
Yeah, that's another one, selection bias. I ask for a volunteer in a workshop. It's kind of like a hypnotist. The people who volunteer for stage hypnosis are the people who are the most suggestible. Yeah. I have a list of about 7 reasons why it's not a particularly valid study.
And you're also only working with people who are therapists, or at least studying therapy. So those people have it together to afford an intensive or a workshop, to probably go to graduate school, to even sit with patients, which in and of itself is not an easy thing to do. So they have a lot of brain power, and they have the act together enough to do that.
Yeah.
A lot of the people I work with don't.
Yeah.
So it's not really a random sampling of the population.
No. There's at least 6 or 7 serious errors, and that's why I've never analyzed the data in the past. But then people were pressuring me, to even, maybe your claim isn't even valid, David. So I thought, well, maybe it's not. I better go and see what the data holds. Mm-hmm. But I thought it was kind of interesting in spite of that. Because when I was younger, before I had team therapy, all those same factors were going on, but I never got these kinds of results.
Yeah. Well, yeah, of course. So here's the 5th one. So this is the confirmation paradox, and this is something that is one of the flaws and biases in research. But we use this in common understanding of our world, and this is a fallacy.
Well, maybe you can help with this one too, Fabrice, because I know you're really into philosophy and logic and statistics and science, but the idea is if you have a theory that predicts a particular observation, this is like a symbolic logic thing, and then you get that observation, you conclude that confirms your theory.
Yeah.
And therapists do this and have done this from the time of Freud, and it's really a logical error. But let me show you from a scientific example why it's a logical error, and then show how this bleeds into our thinking as psychotherapists or psychologists. So here's a general science example of why the confirmation paradox is a flaw. I have a theory that the sun circles around the earth.
Isn't that true?
Exactly. And then this would lead to the prediction that the sun will come up in the east and go down in the west, and do this every day, day after day after day. Then I have the observation, in fact, the sun does come up in the east and set in the west, exactly as predicted. And so my erroneous conclusion is this proves that the sun does, in fact, circle around the earth. And the reason it's a flaw is because although your theory predicts this observation, an infinite number of other theories would also predict exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
So you, in no way, you're proving your theory. Now, here's a psychological example. And then I saw just today someone asked me to read a blog he'd written on psychoanalysis and exhibitionism, and it made this same kind of flawed thinking. Here's the theory. Perfectionism results from childhood experiences growing up in loving families that emphasized high standards and achievement rather than nurture. That's common theory about why people become insecure and perfectionistic. And so your prediction is that perfectionistic patients will report childhood experiences with one or more unloving parents who push them to work harder and made them feel like they'll only be loved, based on their getting all A's on the report card or something like that. And then
I see that all the time in my practice.
Yeah. And then your observation is your perfectionistic patient does describe his or her childhood in this manner.
Yeah.
And then your erroneous conclusion is, number one, the patient's childhood experiences caused the perfectionism. And number two, the patient will have to work through these childhood experiences if he or she wants to overcome the perfectionism and insecurity. And that's, again, the confirmation paradox.
So are you saying that theories cannot be confirmed?
That's a separate issue. And that's a good one too, but that goes too far from our podcast. I think we could address that on another occasion. That's true in all of science, but this is more of a specific thinking error. And the problem here is we don't know what the cause of perfectionism is. And almost all patients who come to therapy will report, if you ask them if they felt unloved as a child or felt that they had to achieve as a child, they'll almost all say that. But we don't know the cause of perfectionism or depression. All causes that people attribute in psychology and psychiatry are just something that someone made up that have not been proven. For example, I'll just give you an example, then you can rip into this if you like. But let's say that Albert Ellis used to feel that perfectionism is 100% genetic. He liked to take an oppositional point of view, and he's a very smart guy. And that could be the case. But then you would also expect perfectionistic parents to have perfectionistic children, but it would not be a cause and effect relationship. But anyway, that's my common therapist error.
Well, let's say that statistically, if you were to ask your patients who present with perfectionism whether they felt unloved during their childhood, you might say, hey, there's at least 90% of them report that.
Yeah.
But what that omits is that if you were to pick anyone in the street who's willing to be open with you and ask them, so do you feel like you're a perfectionist? And they say no. And then you ask them, did you at any point feel unloved during your childhood? You'll probably find a large percentage of people who also felt that way.
Beautiful. I love what you're saying. Yeah.
So it could be a factor for all I know, but that might not be the cause.
Yeah. There's also environmental pressures. You see on television, experience the thrill of perfection. Go for a Lexus, stuff like that. Or if you become like Stephen Curry and number one in basketball, be number one, and then some fantastic thing will happen in your life. And I'm not trying to be overly negative. All I'm trying to say here is two things. Number one, therapists don't in fact know the causes of things, and therapists who try to sell you Like if they say, oh, your depression's due to a chemical imbalance in your brain. Well, there's no evidence for that. There's never been any evidence for that. We don't know the cause of depression. But that as a therapist, I'm content for having powerful tools to help people change as quickly as possible. And I let it go at that. I don't claim to know the causes of things or promote theories of causality to my patients.
Well, this has turned out to be a long podcast, so we'll have a part 2 for the next 5 common errors that therapists make.
Beautiful.
So I think that this is a good start. Thank you, David.
Good. Thank you.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.